The first time Jax Morris encountered the beast, it was lying half-submerged in a muddy ravine, its blood streaking across its dark, stone-like skin, resembling rivers of scarlet cutting through volcanic terrain. Its eyes, wild and unwavering, locked onto him with a primal intensity that froze even the bravest. Jax had faced a number of predators on Earth, lions in the savannah, polar bears in the Arctic, but nothing had compared to the sheer menace radiating from this beast. It was the Korthor, the top predator of the planet Valtor, renowned throughout the galaxy for its speed, intelligence, and nearly unstoppable ferocity. The Korthor was said to embody the peak of nature's design for a perfect hunter. Jax knew the stories well. Every wildlife expert worth their name knew them. Valtor was a hostile world, and the Korthor was its crown jewel. But this particular one was in trouble. A deep gash ran across its side, and one of its massive back legs twisted at an unnatural angle. Clawed footprints marked the ground, likely from an encounter with the lesser-known but equally dangerous dire wolves that roamed the forests. Despite its injuries, the Korthor held its head high, baring its gleaming fangs as Jax carefully approached. "Well, aren't you stubborn?" Jax muttered quietly. The Korthor growled, a deep, guttural sound that reverberated through the ravine. It was a warning, a declaration of defiance. Even weakened, it wasn't going to submit easily. Jax stopped a few meters away, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to hurt you." Jax spoke softly, knowing the creature couldn't understand his words. Still, his tone remained calm and measured, the same way he would speak to an injured bear or wolf back on Earth. The Korthor snarled again, its tail twitching sharply despite the pain the motion must have caused. Jax noticed the tail, a sharp, jagged spine protruded from its tip, each one glinting like blades under the pale light of Valtor. Behind him, a distant hum grew louder. One of the medical drones from the research station was descending into the ravine, its reflective surface gleaming like a beacon. "The researchers back at base must be watching me," Jax thought. "Pull that thing back," he ordered into his comm device. "You're just going to scare it." "This is the best way to assist," came the reply from Dr. Nils Darnell, the station's lead biologist. "The Korthor won't let you get close enough to help, and we can't risk." "Pull it back," Jax repeated more firmly. He turned off the comm before Darnell could continue. The Korthor's eyes shifted toward the drone, its growl deepening into a full-bodied rumble that made the ground tremble beneath Jax's feet. He glanced at the creature and then back at the hovering machine. "Yeah, I wouldn't trust that thing either," he muttered. With a sharp whistle, Jax waved the drone away. After a moment of hesitation, the drone ascended, its hum fading into the distance. The Korthor's growl softened, but its gaze remained fixed on Jax. "Okay," Jax said, crouching low. "Just you and me now." The Korthor shifted slightly, wincing as its injured leg dragged across the ground. Jax could see the strain in its movements, the way its muscles spasmed in pain. He knew the creature wouldn't survive without help. Infection would set in, and on a planet as harsh as Valtor, that was a death sentence. But getting close enough to assist, now that was the real challenge. Jax didn't try to approach again that day. Instead, he backed off, setting up camp a safe distance away, lighting a small fire for warmth and cooking a protein bar. The Korthor watched him the whole time, its golden eyes gleaming in the darkness. "I'm not going anywhere," Jax said, holding up the protein bar. "You're stuck with me, pal." The Korthor snorted but didn't respond. The following morning, Jax tried something else. He scavenged the area for some local fruits, large, orange globes that resembled oversized berries. From his research, he knew the Korthor occasionally ate them, though it was primarily carnivorous. He rolled one toward the creature, stopping a few feet short of its nose. The Korthor sniffed it but didn't eat, its gaze shifting back to Jax with suspicion. Jax sighed, leaning back on his heels. "Fine," he said. "I'll just sit here until you realize I'm not the enemy." The hours passed. Jax kept busy cleaning his equipment, sketching the Korthor in his notebook, and jotting down observations about its behavior. Every now and then, the creature would shift position, wincing as its wound stretched, but it still refused to let Jax, or anyone, get too close. The drone returned once more, and the Korthor's snarl was immediate and ferocious. It was sent away again, ignoring Darnell's frustrated protests over the comm. Days passed into weeks. Jax established a routine, gradually moving closer each day as he earned the Korthor's reluctant trust. The beast's growls became quieter, its posture less rigid. Still, it kept its sharp eyes trained on him, a reminder that one misstep could lead to disaster. Finally, after 10 days, Jack saw an opening. The Korthor had drifted into a shallow sleep, its breath slow and steady. Moving with care, Jax retrieved a medical kit from his pack and approached, each step agonizingly slow. The Korthor's ear twitched as Jax knelt beside it. Its eyes snapped open, pupils narrowing into slits. Jax froze, his hands raised defensively. "Easy," he murmured. "I just want to help." The Korthor let out a low rumble, its gaze still locked on Jax. Jax remained perfectly still, his heart pounding. After what seemed like an eternity, the Korthor relaxed slightly, lowering its head back onto the ground. It didn't take its eyes off him, but it didn't attack either. Taking that as permission, Jax carefully examined the creature's injuries. The gash on its side was deep but not as severe as he'd feared. The leg, however, was another matter. The bone was fractured, and swelling had already set in. Jax worked quickly, cleaning the wound and applying a salve to prevent infection. When he finished, he sat back, exhaling a shaky breath. The Korthor huffed softly, as if acknowledging his effort. "Guess we're making progress," Jax said with a small smile. For the first time, the Korthor didn't growl. The first rays of dawn crept over the ravine, painting the muddy walls with gold and amber. Jax stirred from his makeshift camp, stiff from sleeping on the uneven ground, but alert. His eyes immediately sought the Korthor. It was still there, lying in the same spot, its massive chest rising and falling with deliberate breaths. "Morning, big guy," Jack said, his voice low and calm. He didn't expect a response, of course, but he had grown used to speaking to the creature as if it were a colleague in the field. It helped fill the silence, and maybe, on some level, the Korthor found it less threatening. The creature's ears twitched at the sound of Jax's voice but didn't move otherwise. That was a good sign. Jax continued with his routine, boiling water for breakfast and rationing his supplies. The research station had offered to send more food by drone, but Jax had declined. He'd rather survive on foraged fruits and protein bars than risk undoing the fragile trust he had built with the Korthor. When the Korthor finally stirred, it raised its head just enough to sniff the air. Its golden eyes locked onto Jax, unblinking, as if assessing him. "You smell the food?" Jax asked with a grin, tearing off a piece of his protein bar and tossing it in the Korthor's direction. It landed within easy reach, but the Korthor didn't move to eat. Jax leaned back against a tree. "Still not a fan of human food, huh? Can't blame you." The day wore on, and Jax returned to his task of tending to the Korthor's wounds. The salve seemed to be working. There was no sign of infection, and the swelling in its leg had reduced slightly. However, the fracture itself remained a problem. Without proper immobilization, the bone wouldn't heal correctly, leaving the Korthor vulnerable. Jax gathered sturdy branches and vines, fashioning a crude splint. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best he could do with what he had. When he approached the Korthor with the splint, the creature let out a low growl, its ears flattening against its skull. Jax stopped a few steps short, holding the makeshift splint in front of him like a peace offering. "Relax," he said in a steady voice. "I know it's not pretty, but it'll help." The Korthor growled deeper, but didn't strike. Jax took that as a reluctant invitation to continue. He carefully positioned the splint, wrapping the vines tightly around the injured leg. The Korthor flinched, emitting a sharp guttural sound, but didn't lash out. Jax murmured soothing words as he worked, his hands steady despite the adrenaline pumping through him. Once the splint was in place, Jax sat back, wiping sweat from his brow. The Korthor tested the contraption with a tentative movement, its claws scraping against the ground. It looked at Jax, its gaze piercing and unreadable. "Yeah, I know," Jax said. "Not exactly state-of-the-art, but it'll hold." The Korthor blinked slowly, its ears twitching. Jax wasn't sure if it meant approval or tolerance, but it was progress. That night, as Jax sat by the fire, he caught the Korthor watching him from its resting place. It wasn't the usual predatory gaze he had grown used to. There was something different in its eyes, curiosity, perhaps, or a flicker of understanding. Jax held up his hands in mock surrender. "Don't look at me like that. I'm just trying to keep you alive." The Korthor huffed, a sound somewhere between a growl and a sigh. Jax chuckled. I'll take that as a thank you. The next days brought subtle but noticeable changes in the Korthor's behavior. It allowed Jax to approach more freely, even tolerating his presence as he cleaned and wrapped its wounds. The creature's growls grew softer, less hostile, though it remained watchful. Jax continued to forage for food, venturing farther into the surrounding forest. The Korthor's condition was stabilizing, and although its injuries kept it grounded, it was still a predator. Jax wasn't about to underestimate its instincts. One such excursion brought Jax to a trail of dire wolf tracks. His stomach twisted. The wolves were fierce hunters, and their territory often overlapped with the Korthor's. If they returned, they would pose a serious threat to the injured predator. Jax hurried back to the ravine, his mind racing. When he arrived, the Korthor was lying in the shade of a twisted tree. Its golden eyes snapped open at the sound of his arrival. We might have company soon, Jax said, kneeling beside the creature. Big, toothy company. The Korthor's ears flicked, but it didn't seem concerned. Jax envied its calm. He spent the rest of the day fortifying the area, stacking rocks and branches to create barriers that might slow down the wolves. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. As night fell, Jax sat by the fire, his senses alert. The Korthor rested nearby, its tail twitching occasionally in its sleep. Then, just before midnight, the first howl cut through the silence. Jax stiffened, instinctively reaching for his tranquilizer gun. The howl was followed by another, then another, each one closer than the last. The Korthor's eyes snapped open, its ears swiveling toward the sound. It rose to its feet, muscles coiled and ready. Jax felt a chill run down his spine. Stay down, he whispered, though he knew the words were futile. The wolves arrived moments later, their glowing eyes and sleek bodies emerging from the shadows. They spread out in a semicircle, moving deliberately. Jax raised his tranquilizer gun, aiming at the largest wolf. All right, guys, he muttered, let's not do anything stupid. The lead wolf growled, revealing razor-sharp teeth. The pack tensed, ready to strike. Then the Korthor roared, a sound like nothing Jax had ever heard before. A deep, guttural bellow that shook the ground itself. The wolves froze, their confidence faltering. Despite its injuries, the Korthor stood tall, its dark hide gleaming in the firelight. It roared again, and this time the wolves retreated, tails between their legs. Jax lowered his gun, his heart pounding. He glanced at the Korthor, a mixture of awe and gratitude flooding him. Remind me never to get on your bad side, he muttered. The Korthor didn't respond, but as it settled back down, Jax could have sworn there was a hint of satisfaction in its eyes. The Korthor had started moving again, though each step was marked by the stiffness of its healing injuries. Jax watched as it limped along the ravine, testing its weight on the injured leg. The fractured bone had been set, and the swelling had reduced. Still, the predator's recovery was far from complete, and it knew it. It growled low whenever Jax got too close, though it no longer snarled or bared its fangs as it once had. The change in behavior was subtle, but Jax recognized it for what it was, a quiet acknowledgement of his presence, if not full trust. You're stubborn as hell, you know that? Jax muttered, crouching nearby. The Korthor turned its head, fixing him with a piercing stare. For a moment, Jax thought he'd overstepped, but the creature simply huffed and continued its slow, deliberate pace. Jax had been shadowing the Korthor for weeks now, his days spent ensuring it didn't further injure itself while gathering data on the surrounding environment. He had stopped calling for backup from the research station after the creature made it clear that only Jax could be trusted. The Korthor had made its choice. One afternoon, while collecting samples from a nearby stream, Jax heard a sharp, guttural bark from the Korthor's direction. He froze, his heart leaping into his throat. The sound wasn't the usual growl of annoyance, it was sharper, more urgent. Dropping his tools, Jax sprinted back toward the ravine. He found the Korthor standing near a thicket of gnarled shrubs, its injured leg trembling. Its tail lashed, and its ears were flat against its skull. Something was wrong. Jax scanned the area, narrowing his eyes as he spotted movement in the underbrush. 3 dire wolves, sleek and wiry, were closing in. The Korthor let out another bark, louder and more forceful. The wolves hesitated, lowering their heads as they crept closer, tense and ready to strike. Jax's mind raced. He had no weapons, no way to fend them off. and the Korthor was in no condition to fight them off alone. "All right, think, Jax," he muttered under his breath. The first wolf lunged, and the Korthor met it with a swipe of its claws, sending the beast skidding. The other two wolves darted in, snapping at the Korthor's flanks. Jax didn't think, he just reacted. Grabbing a long branch from the ground, he charged. "Get away from it," he shouted, waving the branch wildly. The wolves recoiled, startled. One of them turned toward Jax, its lips curling into a snarl. "Yeah, come on then," Jax yelled, jabbing the branch toward the wolf. The wolf hesitated, its ears flattening as it assessed this new threat. Behind it, the Korthor let out another thunderous roar. Its tail whipped around, striking another wolf with its spines. The injured predator was holding its ground, its golden eyes blazing with defiance. Jax swung the branch again, pushing the wolves back another step. The predators exchanged glances, reconsidering their odds. Finally, with a frustrated yip, the wolves retreated into the underbrush, disappearing as quickly as they had arrived. Jax let out a shaky breath, his hands trembling as he dropped the branch. He turned to the Korthor, which was still standing tall, breathing heavily but resolute. Its gaze met his, and for a moment they just stared at each other. "Looks like we make a pretty good team," Jax said, his voice hoarse. The Korthor huffed softly, its tail swishing in what could have been approval. For the first time, Jax thought he saw something in its eyes, a flicker of trust. The Korthor's recovery had taken a significant step forward after their encounter with the wolves. Although it still moved with a limp, it seemed reinvigorated, as if the battle had awakened its indomitable spirit. Jax noticed it standing taller, its injured leg supporting more weight each day. Meanwhile, Jax tried not to collapse from exhaustion. Between monitoring the Korthor, scouting for supplies, and fending off occasional threats, his days felt like an endless cycle of work. But he wasn't about to stop, not when they had come this far. The Korthor had grown used to Jax's presence, following him at a cautious distance whenever he ventured out. At first, Jax thought it was coincidence, but the more he watched, the more he realized the creature was deliberately staying close. It was a strange feeling to be shadowed by something that could easily kill him, yet the Korthor's demeanor was calm, almost protective, as if it had decided Jax was part of its territory now. One evening, as Jax sat by the fire, scribbling in his journal, the Korthor lay a few meters away, its breathing slow and steady, golden eyes half closed in the flickering light. "You know," Jax said aloud, glancing at the creature, "I've got people back at the station who think I'm crazy for sticking around out here. They say you're a lost cause." The Korthor didn't respond, of course, but its ear twitched as if acknowledging his voice. "But I don't buy that," Jax continued. "You're not just some animal. You've got fight in you. And I'll be damned if I let anyone write you off." The Korthor shifted, its tail curling around its body. Jax smiled to himself, taking the movement as a sign of agreement. The days that followed were marked by small victories. He watched as the Korthor began hunting again, its movements cautious but precise. It targeted smaller prey at first, swift rodents and lizard-like creatures. With each successful hunt, its confidence grew, and Jax couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. It wasn't just the Korthor that had changed. Jax found himself relying on the creature in ways he hadn't expected. The first time he spotted another pack of dire wolves lurking nearby, it was the Korthor that scared them off with a warning growl. Another time, when Jax accidentally stepped too close to a nest of venomous insects, the Korthor swatted the ground with its tail, scattering the swarm before they could attack. Their partnership, strange as it was, had become a lifeline. One morning, while inspecting a cluster of moss-covered rocks, Jax heard the now familiar hum of a research drone. His stomach sank as he spotted the source of the noise, larger than the drones Darnell had sent before. Jax muttered under his breath, shielding his eyes against the sun. The polished exterior of the drone gleamed like a beacon. Jax's calm crackled to life a moment later. "Carver, this is Dr. Darnell," the scientist's voice said, sharp and commanding. "We've detected dire wolf activity in your area. The drone is equipped to provide assistance." "I don't need your help," Jax snapped, glaring at the hovering machine. "We've got things under control." "You're risking your life for a single animal," Darnell said. "It's time to stop playing games. Let the drone do its job." Jax opened his mouth to argue, but the Korthor's reaction silenced him. The creature had risen to its feet, its fur bristling. It let out a deep growl and took a menacing step forward, its gaze locked onto the drone with unbridled fury. Jax had seen that look before. It was the same expression the Korthor had worn during the battle with the wolves. "Pull the drone back," Jax ordered into the comm, his voice low but firm. Now, there was a long pause before a frustrated sigh came through the line. "Fine, but this is your responsibility, Carver." The drone's hum faded as it ascended and disappeared over the ridge. The Korthor's growl subsided but remained tense. Its eyes scanned the horizon for any other threats. Jax let out a slow breath. "Thanks for not overreacting," he said quietly. The Korthor flicked its tail in what Jax took to be an unimpressed glare. It settled back onto the ground.